Boa tarde a todos. Vamos então dar início à sessão da tarde, espero que despertos, dando sequência a esta segunda fase do Trabalho 4.0, Tecnologia, Trabalho e Emprego no século XXI. E a mim compete-me apresentar a nossa oradora da tarde, a Ursula Huws, que é professora de Estudos Internacionais e do Trabalho e Emprego na Hertfordshire Business School, sendo editora da revista interdisciplinar Work, Organization, Labour and Globalization e autora, entre outros, do livro The Making of Cyber-Threat Virtual Work in a Real World e Labour in a Contemporary Capitalism, What Next?, que será objeto da nossa apresentação de hoje. Neste livro, Ursula reúne os resultados de décadas de persistentes pesquisas sobre a transformação no mercado de trabalho, apresentando-nos uma visão geral dos impactos das mudanças tecnológicas, económicas, sociais e políticas sobre a vida profissional no século XXI. Tenho ainda a oportunidade de passar em relance as atuais convulsões nos mercados de trabalho globais e os mitos sobre os impactos da robotização e inteligência artificial no trabalho, apontando os processos pelos quais novos empregos são criados, bem como os antigos empregos são destruídos, sem subestimar os impactos contraditórios da digitalização na organização do trabalho, adaptabilidade e inovação. A sua pesquisa recente debruça sobre o crowd work, também conhecido como gig economy, o trabalho nas plataformas digitais e a exportação destas práticas para as relações laborais convencionais, que foi também objeto da apresentação durante a manhã. Trabalho no capitalismo contemporâneo e a seguir é uma obra que, independentemente de se concordar ou não com as suas mensagens base, constitui uma referência importante que nos obriga a refletir sobre o impacto da tecnologia e digitalização no futuro do trabalho. Ursula, thank you for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Too much technology here. Apologies first of all for having to address you all in this terrible global language of English, for which I apologise. I'm as much of a victim of it as you are because my mother tongue is Welsh, but there we are. This is the language of global capitalism, by and large. And also thank you very, very much to the organisers for inviting me to this beautiful conference centre. It's the most wonderful place. I feel really privileged to be here. I'm going to be talking a little bit in quite general terms about technology and the future of work, and then end by presenting some of my recent research on platform work in Europe. But to start, I think it's really important to be aware of the pitfalls that confront us when we want to predict the future of work. The history, I've been around long enough to remember the prophecies that people were making in the 1960s and 1970s about the future of work. And the history of these prophecies is basically a history on the whole of people getting everything spectacularly wrong. And I think we need to think about why forecasters get things wrong. First of all, there's a kind of general assumption that trends are linear, that you can go on extrapolating. Whatever's happening now is going to go on happening, only more and more so. Which is, apart from anything else, it's very, you could say, undialectical. Because, when a trend starts happening, if it impacts people positively or negatively, then they're going to act either to resist the change or to encourage the change according to what their social position is in relation to that technology. And the behaviour that they adopt when they resist it then affects what happens to that trend. So there's a constant process of an innovation and then a reaction to that innovation and then people reacting to the reaction to that innovation and so on, which is extremely difficult to predict, but is certainly not linear in any traditional sense. Secondly, there is a tendency for people writing about the future of work, to look at existing work as reflected in the existing statistics, and to say this is like the total landscape of work is this. It's these occupations and these industries which are recorded in our national or international statistics. And let's look at what this technology is going to do to these existing statistically visible jobs. And that was happening. I remember that happening in the 1970s. People saying the silicon chip will destroy 6 million jobs in the UK. These kind of predictions. We're getting it now. There've been predictions from the Bruegel think tank in Brussels and from Oxford University, and saying very authoritatively how many million jobs are going to be replaced by robots, for instance. And this is, firstly, it doesn't take account of the very many kinds of labour which are currently not visible in the statistics but might become so in the future as unwaged work changes into waged work, for instance. And it doesn't take account of any kind of secondary consequences that might happen. So it's extremely problematic. I'll go on to illustrate a little bit that. It leads classically to zero-sum game fallacies. We saw this in the 90s, for instance, when offshore outsourcing to India became a thing, in the run-up to the conversion to the euro and that big scandal, if you all remember it, about how the millennium bug was going to stop every computer in the world in its tracks, and all these software development jobs were outsourced to India from the United States and from Europe. And there was this kind of idea that every job created in India meant a job lost in the United States or in Europe. And that is manifestly not how development happens. So the zero-sum game fallacy plays a very important part, but also a very unhelpful part in informing these extrapolations. There tends to be a focus on the disappearing jobs rather than the newly appearing jobs. And that's partly because the disappearing jobs disappear in large numbers. A factory gets closed and 2,000 jobs go, whereas new jobs might be created in a much more dispersed and invisible way. And I think it's partly because the newly emerging jobs are very, very hard to define also. And then, as I said earlier, there's generally a complete failure to take account of the ways in which trends are shaped by resistance and by reaction and by unexpected new applications of innovations. For example, looking at these unintended consequences or unexpected applications, for instance, that a lot of the recent technological innovations we've seen have been put to very unexpected use when mobile phones were first introduced. There was first a very slow uptake, and then which very rapidly increased, so sort of around the early 90s. But nobody predicted that among the first adopters of mobile phones would be basically criminals, people who had good reason not to want to know whereabouts. They didn't want to be in the phone book. They didn't want people to know where they were. So it was drug dealers and pimps and, other kinds of criminals were using mobile phones. We now see that, the first adopters of the internet to make money, a lot of them were pornographic sites, for instance. We now see in the UK there's a huge problem in prisons of drones being used to smuggle in mobile phones and drugs and etc. And nobody predicted these criminal uses. And the criminal uses actually lead to a whole swathe of other activities trying to police them. And these are jobs that nobody predicted, that there would, for instance, be tens of thousands of jobs around the world involved in moderating content for the internet. People who spend all day looking at videos of child sexual abuse and people being beheaded, in the Middle East and so on, to pull them off the internet. So these unintended consequences are very unpredictable. And there's also tends to be, in any prediction about work, people get pushed into these polarized camps of the optimists and the pessimists. with people who see the negative impacts on labour being cast usually as pessimists, and people who want to introduce new applications in an unregulated way, typically being cast as optimists. But you also get a kind of what you might call a kind of in the present wave, the kind of Californian hippie techno-optimism about like the sharing economy and so on. But there are these different camps which very much confuse the discourse. So where are we now? That we've got a global context with an absolutely unprecedented concentration of capital, with a relatively small number of absolutely huge companies, with dominating, whether you look at it in terms of the proportion of employees around the world who are employed directly or indirectly by companies, whether you look at market share, whether you look at profits. There was a kind of tipping point around 2006 when there was 1 year just before the financial crisis when the global share of multinational companies increased by over 20% in 1 year, and it's been going up since then. We've got, in a kind of a creeping way, sometimes happening under the radar, sometimes happening formally, we're seeing a steady decline of what we might call the normative 20th century model of work. The idea that work is a full-time permanent job for which you get trained at the beginning of your career, and it gives you a set of qualifications that you can use for the rest of your career, and then you get a pension at the end, and any unfortunate kind of interruption of that career, like sickness or unemployment or whatever, is seen as a kind of a misfortune which is dealt with through an insurance model. I mean, that never applied to the majority of workers around the globe, and even in the most developed European welfare states, it never applied to all workers. But nevertheless, that was a very, very, I think, important aspirational model, and which has been slowly declining. But I think it's still in people's heads. That it's a kind of idea that that's what work should look like. Ideally, that's what work should look like. We've seen in Europe and also elsewhere around the world, the aftermath of the economic crisis of 2008 was huge in terms of austerity and in terms of the dismantling of various kinds of social protection that had been around since it was kind of, I suppose, if you kind of like a tipping point in a sense. And in the aftermath of that crisis, a huge wave of restructuring of organizations based partly on kind of applying new technologies to old industries to make them more productive, and to increase the productivity of workers by automating jobs and so on. But partly through actually the generation of new commodities, the use of these technologies to generate new commodities out of areas of life that previously were outside capitalism, like, for instance, biological products based on the DNA of plants, or new drugs and so on. The commodification of biology, you might say, and the commodification of sociality itself through things like social media and so on. But also not just commodification in a simple sense of generating new commodities, but the applications of technology to for the management of work and for new kind of organizations. So new organizational models, new business practices, if you like, using the new technologies, which are often based, at least in their early stages, and I would argue we're in the early stages at the moment of a lot of these new industries, based actually on a rental model, or not actually changing the nature of the work that's done in the way that automation in the factory might do, but based on bringing work that was formerly outside the scope of capitalism within the scope of multinational companies in order to take a rent for it. An Uber driver is doing the same thing as a traditional taxi driver. But Uber is taking a rent from that activity, you know, a platform like Helpling providing cleaning services. There's nothing new about being a cleaner working in somebody's house. What's new is having the work organized via a platform and having 25% of the value of that transaction kind of hoovered out and realized in California or wherever. So this restructuring, I mean, it's a complex process and it's ongoing and it's happening very, very fast. And there's a huge amount of research still to be done to understand its dynamics. But as people struggle to understand it, what happens, and it's happened in previous waves of technological change, it happened after usually about 5 or 6 years after an economic crisis when the restructuring starts to become visible. So it happened in the late 70s after the crisis of 73. It happened in the 90s after the crisis of 1990. And it's happening again now. And that is a huge proliferation of new technology, of new terminology, this kind of new language that people use. In the 70s, it was information superhighways and knowledge economy and that kind of terminology. And in teleworking, telecommuting, networking, e-work, you know, when people are trying to comprehend a new phenomenon, they tend to come up with this terminology, which actually makes it incredibly difficult to talk about it because nobody quite knows what these new terms mean. And we're getting it now. Oh, sorry. My slides are coming up in the wrong order. Another really important feature of the current landscape is that we now have a global division of labour. I think around 1990, around the time the Berlin Wall came down, you know, and the former Soviet Union and China and so on became part, the WTA was set up around then, the ITU was set up around then. We saw the beginnings then of a global division of labour in services as well as in manufacturing, using a global workforce with standardized tasks, standardized skills, using global languages, often working for the same companies, and which was accessed in two very different ways. One was by sending the jobs to the people, you know, offshoring a production to China or offshoring IT services to India or something like that. Or alternatively, by bringing the people to the jobs through migration, the increasing use of migrant workers. But we now have a situation where that global division of labour is really quite advanced, and I guess we're living with some of the very negative political consequences of that. Because in the mid-20th century, there were kind of solidarities between the indigenous working class and what Karl Marx would have called the reserve army of labour, because they lived in the same cities and they were each other's neighbours, and it was possible to build a kind of solidarity that social democratic parties in Europe used to build their welfare states. And it's much more difficult to build those kind of solidarities when the workers are on the other side of the world and don't speak the same language. And so I think there's, it's not news to anyone, I think there is really a link between this development of this global division of labour and the kind of right-wing, the growth of these right-wing populist parties that we're seeing across Europe right now. Anyway, on to my next slide. Oops. Oh, no, this is very weird. It's coming up in the wrong order. There we are. Just to look quickly at this point I was making earlier about job losses versus job gains, you know. The thing is that both are happening to quite a considerable extent. On the left-hand side, we've got the risks of job losses. You've got, or shifts. They're not actually necessarily lost altogether, but they're lost on a particular geographical spot. We've got a continuing shift of manufacturing industry to the global south. We've got growth of automation, which is increasing the productivity of workers and reducing numbers in particular workplaces. We've got a huge externalization of labour onto consumers, people doing for nothing what was formerly the job of a paid service worker, whether it's booking our own airline tickets or taking our own cash out of machines or doing the automated checkout in a supermarket or whatever. There's a huge loss of paid work as a result of self-service. There are, of course, threats to traditional retail industries from online shopping, and there's a huge shift from the public sector to the private sector through outsourcing. So there are a lot of aspects to job losses, but there are also an awful lot of potential job gains, because all these, if you like, the means of production that are used to increase the productivity of traditional workers become the basis of new manufacturing industries. Somebody's got to make the robots and the drones and the 3D printers and all the rest of it. I was in Slovenia last week, and they told me that there's a factory just about to open in Slovenia in which robots will be made by robots. It'll be the first factory in Europe where robots are used to make robots. So they're complex patterns here. You've got, as I said earlier, you've got new industries based on bioproducts. You've got all the new manufacturing industries, of course, need services. Manufacturing industries are always fed by services and create new service industries. So there are a whole load of other service industries related to those manufacturing industries, whether it's R&D or design or the logistics to transfer them around the world, or cleaning the factory, or whatever it is. There's a whole load of service industries there. The growth in outsourcing actually creates jobs in the private sector, even while it might destroy jobs in the public sector. I'm going to talk about this later, because it seems to me that this is a very key thing that the platform economy is doing. You've got a marketization of household services, new jobs creating, delivering what you might, the kind of household work that in the past might have been done unpaid, which is now done as part of a paid service industry. The marketization of sociality and culture, all those thousands of jobs, what you might call the hidden housework of the internet, the click workers that Umar was talking about this morning, and the content moderators and so on. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs are involved in providing these kind of internet services, you might say. And as I said earlier, the formalization of the informal economy. So, just to give a feel of this new terminology we're all living with at the moment, I mean, I could go on forever with these terms, actually. Some of these terms come from different sources, like sharing economy, for instance, and peer-to-peer networking are terms that come from this idealistic, positive, optimistic, Californian kind of idea. Terms like liquid labor or crowdsourcing or cloud sourcing relate much more to the traditional kind of management terminology that grew up in the period of offshore outsourcing. The idea that you use the technology to source the cheapest possible labor to do a particular task, and you pay them only for that task. And then we've got terms like the gig economy, which borrow from this kind of idea of creative freelance workers and so on. So you've got all this terminology and no very precise definitions, so no way of actually measuring any of these things, but a huge amount of discourse about them and a huge amount of debate about are they good things or bad things and so on. That's the current favourite management term in Europe, online talent platforms. Oh, God, sorry, there's more just-in-time workforce. Anyway, but meanwhile, we've got this new corporate landscape. We've got all these kinds of companies, this is just a few, which are very much, they've become very familiar very, very quickly in the last 3 years or so. 3 years ago, I could show a slide like this and ask the audience to put up their hand if they'd heard of these platforms, and maybe only 1 or 2 hands would go up. And now, I mean, I didn't try it, but I imagine a very high proportion of you would recognize a lot of these platforms. So how do we make sense of them? It's, I think it's difficult and not very useful to try and see them as something that has just appeared out of nowhere, that just was invented in California in 2010, which was the year that Airbnb and Uber were both founded, just after the crisis. It seems to me that it's much more useful to see this development as a convergence, if you like, of a lot of existing trends that are now reaching critical mass. The idea of using an online platform for managing work is actually quite old. We have had, at least for the last 15 years, you've had, for instance, supermarket chains using an internal digital platform to decide that, you know, such and such a branch of the supermarket needs 2 extra people on till 3 and 4 on a Friday afternoon when there's more shopping, and so on. So in the retail industry, in warehouses, in call centers, these kind of platforms have been used to summon workers on a just-in-time basis. It's, you know, it's not a new thing. IBM introduced an internal platform, I can't remember when, but more than 10 years ago, for doing this kind of stuff. So the technology has been there for some time. Of course, it's got a lot more sophisticated since then. And this spread of just-in-time working is not only within organizations for their permanently employed staff, just to redeploy them in the most efficient way, which is how it started off being used, but increasingly it's being used to also draw in external workers who are not employees, using things like 0 hours contracts or using temporary work agencies and so on. The logic underpinning all this, which is very critical for the whole of the global division of labour, the critical underpinning logic is a logic of standardization and simplification of work tasks. Because the more standard and simple the tasks are, the more they can be reconfigured. The more you don't need a very skilled worker to do them because they only have to do one thing. But more importantly, you are able to organize work on a kind of modular basis. So it's like Lego bricks. You know, you can disperse them or you can put them together. You can make a vertical tower or you can make a horizontal strip. You can reconfigure all these tasks in a large number of different ways, in the knowledge that they can be remotely managed because they're standard. Once something's standard, it can be counted and it can be quantified. So you don't have to have workers who are physically there, that you stand over them and make sure they're working, which was the traditional way. They can be doing the work any way you like, because all you need to do is to count the output. And so this standardization and simplification, some people call it taskification of work, is the underpinning logic, it seems to me, of this whole phase of work organization that we're in right now. And of course, it's a similar logic that underpins other aspects of globalization. For instance, you know, the so-called container revolution in the 1960s of the shipping industry absolutely was the underpinning technology for global trade, for the seamless moving of goods, you know, around the world. The standard container that could be moved from a ship to a train to a truck without any human labor doing complex rehandling of the contents, you know, was an absolutely key underpinning technology for global trade. And in just the same way, these standard tasks, typically with standard qualifications and standard certification, are the underpinning logic of the global division of labour. And the digitalization of these tasks means that they can be, the results can be transmitted from anywhere to anywhere where the right infrastructure is in place. So that adds another dimension. The use of the data derived from online activities in turn, this is a major, major trend, can then be used for setting targets and for performance monitoring. So you get a kind of self-confirming cycle where the more things people do online, the more data is generated. The more data is generated, the more precisely you can analyze what the workers are doing, and you can set new targets. So the wheel turns. And increasingly, the use of things like customer ratings for measuring performance is part of that process. So this is a trend that was going on generally. It's a trend that obviously is found in its most extreme form in online platforms, but it's not exclusive to those online platforms. Since the 80s, really, there's been an increasing expectation for workers to be available to check messages outside working hours. We used to call it teleworking. But this general trend which is, I suppose if you look at it in a classical way, it's an extension of the working day, actually. It means that the employer gets all kinds of time that is not paid for, in the knowledge that, an email will be read on a Sunday, for instance, even though you're not formally working on a Sunday, this kind of thing. So that's another major trend. The trend to work on the move, which is enabled by mobile technologies, has been growing. It's not new to have freelancers. There have always been self-employed people. But traditionally, freelancers found work through word of mouth, through directories. There would be published directories, often annually published directories of, for instance, graphic designers or translators or whatever it was, or through agencies, or more low-skilled, informal working people found work through word of mouth, through putting leaflets through people's letterbox, through an ad in the local telephone directory, through notice board in the local newsagents or whatever. There were all these traditional ways of finding work. And suddenly these have all had to migrate online because nobody looks at the leaflets that come through the letterbox anymore. They go to Google. The first thing you do is you go to Google when you want something, whether it's a service, whether it's shopping, whether it's finding a romantic partner, whatever it is. People go online to find it. And the difference between going online and going to a traditional telephone directory is the power of the tag, you could say. So when you go to, if you put in your postcode and you say you want a plumber, you kind of expect that what comes to the top of the list will be a local plumber in your postcode. But in fact, if a clever online platform has tagged every postcode in Portugal and every occupation in Portugal, what comes to the top of the list will be a global platform. You might not know it's a global platform, but that's what's going to come to the top of the list. You might have to go down 5 pages in Google to find somebody who's a genuine local plumber. And who's going to do that? You go for the one that comes near the top. So this use of the online search engine as a sort of portal into almost any kind of economic or social transaction is a very important trend for explaining the exponential growth of online platforms. And I think we can see some of it, especially the kind of online platforms that Uma was speaking about earlier, which incidentally mostly were not founded after the financial crisis, but before. Elance and Freelancer, for instance, and Amazon Mechanical Turk emerged in around 2004, 2005. And what you can see there, Mars, is a kind of evolution from the kind of global sourcing that reached critical mass for big companies in the 1990s. But the problem for the model that was around in the 1990s, there was very high transaction costs. If you were a big company and you wanted to find somebody to develop your software in Bangalore, you had to employ a middleman, or you had to get on a plane and go to Bangalore and talk to people, and it might go wrong. So the transaction costs were very, very high. But what emerged in the early 2000s was the idea of having an online intermediary who took all the risk out of it, because supply and demand could be matched by the platform. So it means that even an individual or a small firm could find somebody very easily, and they pay for it, instead of paying for it up front, they pay through this kind of rental model of paying the platform either a fee or a proportion of the value of the transaction or whatever. So I think it's useful to see some kinds of platforms as an evolution of global sourcing. Now here's some weird bullet points, sequencing again. I'm now going to present you very quickly the results of a survey that we still haven't quite finished. It's around 2015, that's 4 years ago now, I started doing research on these online platforms, and it became very clear that there was actually no empirical evidence whatsoever of the extent of them. There were surveys that were done through particular platforms, but there was no way of knowing how typical those platforms were and how much you might be double counting people who were on the same platform with more than one identity, or who were on more than one platform or whatever. So there was some very useful research, but it didn't give you a general feel of the extent of these practices. And of course, nobody had a definition, and so you couldn't find them in the official statistics. And so I rather rashly, in 2016, I was approached by FEPS, the European Foundation for Progressive Studies, and who, in collaboration with Uni Europa, which is the European Trade Union Federation, they decided to commission originally one survey in the UK. I thought, well, let's just try and see what happens. Like, you know how you put a jam jar in a pond and lift it out to see what kind of pond life is swimming around in the water when you're a child. You know, it was a little bit like that. Let's do a random sample of the entire population, do an online omnibus survey, and see what we found. And we didn't really expect to find very much platform work because there was no definition. You had to ask a whole series of questions to try and identify, separate it out from other kinds of work. And what we found was actually a rather surprisingly high, much higher than we expected, level of platform work broadly defined, whereupon every other country in Europe just about said, we want a survey too. So we've now done surveys in 13 countries. The results from Czechia just came in last week. We haven't analysed them yet. But it is, this slide talks about Slovenia, because that's the last country where I presented the results, excuse me. But anyway, so this survey was piloted in the UK, then carried out in these countries, and because the results was so surprising, we tested it by doing the same survey offline in face-to-face surveys in one country and by telephone in another country, just to check we weren't just picking up an effect of it being an online survey. Anyway, right. In the way we defined platform work very broadly in the survey is paid work managed via online platforms. So we excluded, or tried to exclude, unpaid work and other forms of generating an income online. For instance, renting out a room through Airbnb or selling your possessions on eBay or something like that. You know, well, these are valid economic activities, but they don't actually involve selling your labour. And we were interested in the sale of labour. But we recognise there's a very fuzzy distinction between what's paid and what's unpaid. As Ulma was saying earlier, you know, a client might post, they say, please design me a logo, you know, and 10 people submit a design and only one of them gets paid, for instance. There's also a very, very unclear definition of what an online platform is. We found a lot of people were finding work through things that don't actually match the definition of an online platform that most of us would use, but it was online and it was a website, but it had a different business model. Anyway, so we came up with this functional typology, basically. 3 basic types of labour that people sell online. And one is the kind of online work that's carried out remotely in your own home, with the sort that Uma was talking about, platforms like Upwork or Clickwork or Crowdflower or whatever, where people are usually working from their own homes, they're working in isolation, they're in a global labour market competing with people from all around the world who do the same kind of work. The second kind of category is work that's carried out in public spaces. And this is what everybody is so aware of now, the Deliveroos and the Ubers and the people you see on the streets wearing a logo. They're very visible, they're very vocal, they can find each other quite easily, so they're able to organise in the way that other workers can't organise so easily. And then the third category, which is, in my opinion, the most important but also the most neglected, which is the offline work that is carried out in other people's homes. Cleaning, household maintenance, care work, repair, and platforms such as TaskRabbit. There are hundreds of these platforms. And it represents, I suppose you could say, for some of these workers, a kind of formalization of the informal economy, work that's been carried out for a long time, but previously not declared work, so not visible in the statistics. So these are the, oh, sorry, my hearing aid is beeping at me. I won't change the battery. So this is, just to put it in context, this is for looking at, I guess I took this from the presentation for Spain, because Spain is labelled. It's the nearest to Portugal. This is the results from 8 countries. And it puts platform work in the context of people generally making an income online. And as you can see, people turn to the internet for an income in a lot of different ways. They sell stuff, they might buy stuff and sell it on a dedicated website as a business, or they might just sell their own property, or they might make craft products and sell them, or they might rent out a room. And so platform work, selling your labour, is only one of these activities, and it's actually not as important as a lot of the others. In Spain, there's a particularly high proportion of people renting out rooms, not surprisingly, because there's a very big tourist industry in Spain. It could be Portugal is rather similar, I don't know. But anyway, so to put it in context, platform work is only one of many ways that people generate an income online. And what we've found, I won't show it here, is the more likely you are to do platform work, the more likely you are to do some of these other things as well. So the people who rent out a room on Airbnb may very likely also do platform work, and they may also have a little website where they sell stuff. And so these are not mutually exclusive categories. So in the vast majority of cases, work for online platforms is occasional. It's not a main source of income. It's rarely the only source of income, and it's really the main source of income. So it's something that people are doing to supplement income from other sources, which might be another job, or it might be another kind of activity, income-generating activity. So, as you see, although again it's rather high in Spain, the majority are who say they ever do it is much greater than the proportion who say they do it every week or every month. If you look at it as a source of income, you can see that for the huge majority, it's less than 10% of their income. It's very much a top-up. Although, there are this category at the bottom, there are people who say that it's all of their income, but this is a percentage of, by the way, of all platform workers, not a percentage of the whole population. So 9% of the platform workers in Spain say that it's all their income. In countries, Austria and Germany, it's like about 4%, 3 or 4%, something like that. So it's not accurate really to think of platform workers as like a special kind of worker. They are not a special kind of worker. You can't differentiate them from the general mass of the working poor, if you like, or even from the general working population, because most of them, it's not their primary identity, work identity. So this is one of many reasons why it seems to me it's a very silly idea to try to create special regulations that apply only to platform workers. Because platform work is just part of a whole portfolio of activities that these workers have. Mostly, you know, sometimes they're doing it on top of a full-time job, sometimes they're bundling together a lot of different kinds of precarious work to try to construct basically an income on which they can survive. So, who are they? Sorry, did I put gender in there? Yes, the proportion of women, it's not dissimilar from the global figures that Uma was presenting earlier. In most countries, there are more men than women, but it's not a huge gender difference in Europe. In the UK and Italy, there are actually slightly more women. In other European countries, there are slightly more women. In Spain, there are quite a lot more men. They're somewhat more likely to be young. Again, this is absolutely not a phenomenon of the young, which is often presented as like something that students do or something like that. And our evidence is they are no more likely to be students than in the general population. For instance, in the UK, about 8% of the adult workforce are students, and about 8% of platform workers are students. There isn't a significant difference at all. And quite a lot of older workers are doing it. So it's really, it's quite evenly spread, although it's slightly more likely among the young, but not really hugely. What is more interesting to me, which is I'm going to focus on, I mean, I could go on forever showing you these results. I've tried to just select a very few, is that, and here I've used the example of Spain because it seemed like the closest to Portugal, and it seems to me by far the most interesting finding, really, and that is that the practices of the online platforms spread right across the labour market. They are not confined to the online platforms. The online platforms represent almost a kind of an extreme case, you could say, or a tip of the iceberg, really, in relation to some of these practices. I look here at 4 practices. One is the rather common one, which is sending or receiving work-related emails from home. We're all familiar with that. It's been around for a long time, like teleworking. So as you can see there, of the 50% of the Spanish adult working population do this. They you know, send or receive work-related emails from home. And of those, about half are platform workers, but the other half are not. They are people who say they are not platform workers and they never do platform work. Similarly, people who are notified by digital means when there is a task waiting for them to do it. In other words, they have to be on the alert, waiting for a notification that there's a task waiting for them. Again, you can see that there are lots of platform workers who, the bottom category are the weekly, the intensive platform workers, they say they do it weekly, and the middle one are the ones who say they do it occasionally, but the grey ones at the top are the ones who do it all the time. Again, you see it's a really very high proportion of the workforce is now subjected to that kind of control, that kind of, if you, so to speak, precarity within the job of not quite knowing when the next task is coming. The same, increasingly people have to log their working hours. They have to just fill in a form to say, I worked so many hours today or this week, or click on an app to say when they started and when they finished or whatever. And there's a kind of consequence to those, which is that people, the fact that people are interfacing with management via these digital platforms means that they're not having a face-to-face contact with a manager anymore. Increasingly, there are rather high proportions of the workforce whose main interface with their employer is via an app or a digital platform. So that sort of social interaction between workers and managers is increasingly disappearing across the workforce. And then the final category here, which I personally find terribly disturbing. I mean, I'm in an occupation which we've been dealing with, having our work rated by clients for a long time, because university lecturers are constantly rated by their students, you know, rather the same as Uber drivers are rated by their customers. But it's now extended, for instance, I mean, I've been having surgical treatment on my shoulder, and, you know, I'm in the taxi coming home from the hospital, and if something comes up on my mobile phone saying, could I rate my nurse, for instance? And so this rating of workers, you know, it's quite usual in call centres, it's usual in the hospitality industries, for instance. There are a lot of industries where it's very, very widespread, but it seems to me that it's profoundly deprofessionalising. It's very concerning that the quality of a worker's work is judged by an uninformed member of the public rather than by a professional, an informed professional supervisor or peer. And there's now quite a literature which shows, again, Uma presented some of the consequences of this, that there is a profound bias in public assessments. I mean, when university lecturers, you know, you get the lecturer who plays to the gallery, you know, does very popular lectures from which students arguably don't always learn very much, you know, who gets the high ratings. There is a tendency to provoke that sort of behaviour. But there is quite serious scientific evidence, for instance, that black Uber drivers in the United States consistently get lower ratings than white Uber drivers, that women lecturers consistently get lower ratings than male lecturers, that consciously or unconsciously the wisdom of the crowd is actually the prejudice of the crowd, writ large, so to speak. So there are real problems with that. So I think I'll probably end with this slide. I don't know how I'm doing on time. I think the question we have to ask is a new normative model of work emerging, where people are managed by online platforms, carrying out increasingly standardized, measurable tasks, which means that all the unmeasurable tasks become invisible. That's the problem. The problem with measuring performance is that the aspects of the performance that are not measurable start to disappear because people are not rewarded for it. You know, care workers are rewarded for, you know, not exceeding the 15-minute visit, but they're not rewarded for being kind, you know, to the person they're caring for instance. That direct communication with managers is replaced by digital interfaces. That increasingly we have to standardize performance measures and reputation scores, that customer ratings are used to assess the quality of work. And of course, in online platforms, the use of customer ratings is also linked very directly to precariousness, because if ratings fall below a certain level, they're blocked from the platform and they lose work. That people are increasingly indirectly monitored and surveyed, including GPS tracking, which is now very, very widely used. It's not just used for drivers, it's used for all kinds of peripatetic workers. You know, it's obvious in the Deliveroo app, you can see on a map where your driver is, you know, oh, they're in the next street, they're coming around that corner, you know, you can see in real time. But it's also used, for instance, for tracking health workers who visit people in their homes, or care workers, or sales representatives. It's very, very widely used. Unpredictable demands, in the sense of people never knowing when the next task is going to pop up, which means they have to be available unless they have a good employment contract where they know that they will have work next week. They have to be online 24/7, ready to jump when a task comes up, because otherwise somebody else will grab it and then they won't have any work. Repeated requirements to pitch for each job or each promotion. It's always been a saying in the media industries, you're only as good as your last job. But this is increasingly becoming a reality, not only for self-employed workers, but also for people who, on paper, would seem to be secure employees. For instance, you have big companies that work on the basis of project-based work. But if you're on your last project, your performance indicators were not so good, you don't get picked for the next project. And if somebody is not picked, for over a certain period of time, then their job ceases to be secure, even though they may be an employee. I'm thinking a lot of big American companies work on that model, but not only American companies. There's also an expectation that skills will be constantly upgraded. The world that I grew up in, where you worked in, I used to work in the television industry back in the early 70s, and you could say, oh no, that's a job for the cameraman, that's a job for the lighting engineer, that's a job for the sound recordist, that's a job for the production assistant, and all the electricians would go out on strike if the camera assistant carried a lamp up the stairs. There are these very distinct demarcations, and that work is completely gone. The expectation is, if you don't know how to do something, it's your responsibility to learn it. So the kind of skills acquisition stage of the career never stops. And this the 24/7 availability is also increasingly required across many, many different jobs. So formalised yet precarious is what I want to say. Finally, I want to talk about this a little bit more exploratory, about the role of social media and new practices in what I call the grooming of this new workforce. Grooming is usually a term that's used for, encouraging people to have sex with you on the internet. But I think we are seeing a kind of grooming of what I call logged labour. I use logged, it hasn't really caught on as a term, but logged in the sense of broken down into lots of standard units, like the way a tree is broken down into logged. Logged in the sense of being surveyed and monitored and followed like a ship's log, and logged in the sense of having to be logged on all the time, So I call this new paradigm the logged labour. And anyway, I think there are a whole lot of ways that this labour is groomed. First of all, of course, this underlying logic of standardization and fragmentation and mixing and matching of standard ingredients. It's not only a characteristic of labour markets, it's a characteristic of things like dating sites. It's a characteristic of shopping for clothes, You say, I want a black cardigan in a size 18, and whatever. And we kind of get used to seeing things in terms of these standardized permutations of standardized ingredients, if you like. And that, if you like, prepares people for presenting themselves, presenting their CVs in that kind of way, which is the way you have to present yourself on an online platform or for a job advertisement. You have to present yourself as this standard assemblage of ingredients. And if you're used to doing that on an online dating site, well, it becomes obvious that you also do that. It's okay to do that for an employer as well. But so this kind of self-classification becomes almost like a second nature. It's like you classify the rest of the world when you're shopping, but you kind of internalize the logic that you too are someone who is shopped for, so to speak. The other, I think, very invidious aspect of social media is it encourages a situation, particularly among the young, among the kids in their early teens, where you, instead of having a sense of self-esteem, which is based in, a secure identity. You know who you are, and other people know who you are, especially if you come from an established community where everybody knows you as your family and so on. People increasingly have to evaluate themselves in terms of these external likes on Facebook or swipes on dating site or retweets on Twitter or whatever, and they start to measure their worth that way. They say, I posted this picture on Instagram of me in my new party dress and only 5 people thought I looked good. I must be ugly. This kind of internalization of these external sort of quantitative indicators becomes, I think, a quite important aspect of identity formation. And I think it's very, it's quite damaging and quite negative. And we see there's a lot of research that shows how the more time teenagers spend online, the lower is their self-esteem, the more likely they are to be depressed, the more likely they are to self-harm, and the more likely they are to have suicidal thoughts. So this is not something to take lightly. The other thing which I think is profoundly damaging in terms of labour market behaviour is the spread of unpaid internships and work experience. Because what that tells people is that their labour time has no value. The basis of things like trade union organisation is it's rooted in the idea that people's labour time has a value that they shouldn't part with except for a fair price. This is the basis of most kind of trade union negotiation, of social dialogue, of how labour markets work, and the idea that you separate the value of somebody's labour time from the actual time that they put in, combined with this undermining of self-esteem, I think makes people incredibly vulnerable to exploitation on the labour market. Competition is normalised. Solidarity, if you look at reality TV, for instance, I mean, they all give each other a hug before the next person gets chucked off the program, the competitive program for which there can only be one winner, But the values of solidarity are never celebrated. It's the values of competition which are normalized constantly. And this leads to individualization and atomization in the workplace, and a kind of almost a construction of solidarity as something abnormal. And there is also this enormous discourse, if you analyse job advertisements, that workers are supposed to offer on the labour market, not just their labour, but a whole lot of other things on top of the labour. Typically, they talk about passion. We are offering this low-paid job as a waiter, We want somebody who has a passion for food, a passion for customer service, a commitment to the customer, etc., etc. And there are again, this is very much reinforced on daytime TV. I don't know if you have a program called Undercover Boss. It's an American program. There's also a British version of it. It's very poisonous in that way. The CEO of the company goes underground and goes around and watches all the workers to see to what extent they are offering more than the job says. And then in the last scene, they get a kind of reward in television. Of course, in reality, they don't get that kind of a reward. And this kind of erosion of the clear temporal and spatial boundaries around the work, most of our legislation is based on this mid-20th century idea that of the workplace as being the place that you work, and the hours of work being the time that you spend in that workplace. And, for instance, if you have an accident, then it's counted as a work accident if it happens during those hours and in that place, and that's the employer's responsibility. And, the same applies to lots and lots of regulations. And this erosion of temporal and spatial boundaries is also an erosion of a whole bunch of employment rights as well. You can't really separate them. And then the other thing, of course, which is really important is this privileging of digital communication over other forms of communication. I've noticed an extraordinary phenomenon among the young, I don't know if it's just a sign of my age, which people are very, very reluctant to make phone calls now. You get an email exchange, you get about 5 or 6 emails saying, I would like to speak to you by phone, tell me when would be a good time for phone, you know, a negotiation about the time. And 30 years ago, you just picked up the phone and called them, and if it wasn't a good time, we would just say no, you know, and call again tomorrow. And it's partly, I suppose, the experience of those horrible menus you get and call centre experiences and so on. But there's incredible reluctance to engage in face-to-face communication. I mean, I have to say, these are also the people who will bawl out details of their intimate life on the bus into their mobile phone, you know, to their trusted friends. But in a kind of work context, this preference for digital communication is very, very pronounced. And of course, it's the digital communication that leaves the traces that can then be used, that generates the data that can be used by, you know, Google or the Chinese government or whoever it is who wants to follow your movements. I've already made this point. This experience of customer rating as a consumer, you know, we're used to giving the ratings as well as receiving the ratings. But this does lead to a deep deprofessionalization. So I'm going to skip this guy because we're not really here to talk about policy. And so this, in case you want to know more about the survey, this is the report of the first 7 countries. And the data from those first 7 surveys is up online if anyone wants to play with it. And in June, we will publish the results of the other 6 countries as well. So you'll all have a lot of data to play with if that's what you want. Thank you.
Passávamos agora então a uma parte de perguntas e respostas. Eu só queria dar aqui 2 notas. Ursula falou-nos mais uma vez das ameaças e oportunidades da economia das plataformas e do futuro do trabalho. Confesso que, em algumas áreas, com exemplos preocupantes do que será o futuro do trabalho. Eu deixaria, no entanto, para a Assembleia as perguntas que quisessem fazer, pedia ao favor de se identificarem e faziam cada uma das perguntas.
Vou fazer em português, que é mais fácil, se calhar, para se compreender. Antes de mais, muito obrigado pela exposição. E a minha pergunta tem a ver com esta questão da mediação que representam estas plataformas. Em muitos casos, as plataformas representam uma nova mediação que afasta as empresas tradicionais. Noutros casos, representa outro tipo de dependência comparativamente com a dependência que os trabalhadores tinham ou têm em relação às empresas tradicionais. Em que medida é que esta nova realidade não representa um empowerment do trabalhador, portanto, uma maior autonomia para ele também gerir a sua vida e para também captar uma parte do valor do seu trabalho? Será que estas plataformas não são também uma ameaça para as empresas?
I would like just to first to give some information about Portugal. There are a recent EU research on the digital economy that says 1 in 10 of the Portuguese workers, they have used platforms to raise some income, but among them, just I don't know by heart, but I think it's 2.3 or 2.6, 2.7, less than 3%. They have used platform economy as the main source of income. It represents more than 50% or more than 20 week hours. So just to give you some feedback, which for me is very surprising, the numbers for Spain, they are quite relevant and quite different from what I was expecting. So I wonder, in relation for the first 7 countries, if the sample was taken in 2016 and now this is more recent, so somehow whether this shows a recent trend and this massification of digitalization. On the other hand, I think you mentioned that there is about the new normative model emerging and whether the post-Second World War model is like losing relevance. But it's interesting that I've seen a survey, I don't know if it was Deloitte, but about the Z generation, the generation that came ahead of millennials, of the X. And one of the things that they consider is really relevant to have work stability. They expect to make their career in a single corporate, and the firm has the responsibility for career management and even to give them the skills, which is quite different from what we are seeing right now about the industry 4.0 and the trends that you mentioned, that this certification of skills and putting the responsibility into the workers for this certification. So I would like if you can give some comments on this.
I'm going to come back now because I don't have a, just to that specific question. Oh, sorry? Oh, sorry, right.
Ursula, it's just a quick question. I would like if you could comment a little bit further about the potentials of these digital platforms in terms of promoting new modes of, are you listening? In terms of the organization of trade unions, in terms of the contribution of these platforms to increase new ways of organization, of resistance, especially in these new segments of more precarious workers, as we've been assisting recently some of labor movements or social movements, especially mobilizing the younger generations. They use a lot these platforms as a weapon for mobilization. If you have some information or some reflection on this, please. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, the only reason I was going to come back earlier was because I was frightened of forgetting the questions, but I now have a pen, so it's start with the concrete question about the surveys that were done in 1916 and 17. Yeah, we're aware of that, and we are doing right now in the UK a repeat survey. So because we did the first survey in 2016 in the UK, so we can see what the change has been over 3 years, but we don't have the results of that survey yet. But more importantly, I think if you look geographically, I didn't have a chance to present those results. The kind of expectation that people have about the platform economy is that it's something associated with kind of modernity and urbanization, and that the early adopters of platforms will be people who live in big cities, you know, who've got Wi-Fi, etc. And in fact, the geographical distribution of platform work is absolutely not what you would expect. It fits much more with the hypothesis of the formalization of the informal economy. So you find in the big cities of Germany and Austria, we can't go too much down to a city level, we can go down to a regional level with our data. we find only moderate levels. Where you find the very high levels are in rural areas, which of course have a big tourist industry and a big agricultural industry, which are both very seasonal. So you have people looking for work at the times of year which are not the peak season for their main employment. So if, for instance, in the Alps, in rural parts of northern Italy and Switzerland and Austria and Slovenia, we found very high levels of occasional platform work. And in Spain and in Italy, we also found very high levels, not around Rome and Milan in Italy, but in the south. And in Spain, by far the highest levels are in the southern region of Spain. They're not around Barcelona, they're not around Madrid, they're in the south. And this is partly because there is a very long tradition of a very large informal economy in those regions, and this is a hypothesis we need to investigate further. And also partly because these are regions where you have a lot of newly arrived immigrants. And if you have made your way against all the odds from Syria or Yemen or Afghanistan or wherever it is, with only your mobile phone to guide you, you know, which immigrants are often quite entrepreneurial people, but increasingly, in order to succeed as immigrants, they rely very much on their mobile phones. And you arrive in a city and you have no money, and you don't have informal social networks, word-of-mouth networks to find work in that city because you don't come from there, but you do have your social network with other migrants. So what is the most natural thing in the world to do is that somebody says, look, if you install this app on your phone, you can very quickly get some work. So, so there seems to be an association of platform work, a very strong association with informalization, and because there is already an association between the informal economy and migration, that's part of the picture, if you like. So, so people who expect to find the platform economy in the big cities are very often looking in the wrong place. Although there is, of course, an informal economy also in cities like London, particularly where I live. But the geographical distribution is absolutely not what you expect. And this brings me to Elisio's question about the trade union organisation, because we all hear an awful lot about the organisation, and the big successes usually are the Deliveroo riders and the Foodora riders in Europe. These very visible platform workers who work in cities, you see them on the street, you know, sporting the logo of the country. It's easy for them to organize because they can find each other. They can find each other easily in the same way that in the 19th and early 20th century dock workers could find each other, because they all stood together at the dockside waiting for work to be told, today we will employ you and you and you. And so the Uber drivers to some extent, and even more these delivery riders, have become almost like the symbol of organization in the platform economy. But according to our research, this is actually the smallest group of platform workers. They are greatly exceeded in numbers by the click workers who are working from their own home and by the people working in other people's homes. And these are both groups which are extremely hard to organize. Very, very hard. I mean, there have been around the world campaigns to organize domestic workers in Latin America, for instance, in Brazil, and in California, domestic workers, and in South Africa, domestic workers have organized. And it's not impossible, but these campaigns are quite exceptional. And so I think it's, and with the online click workers, all the research evidence suggests that they are quite reluctant to organize because they see themselves as being in competition with each other. They don't meet each other, so they don't build solidarities in public spaces the way the Deliveroo riders do. So I think it's quite dangerous to kind of say, oh, well, we don't have to worry about regulation because the Deliveroo riders are successfully organizing and they're going to get collective agreements, and that will somehow spread out to the rest of the platform economy. It might work for that sector, but it seems to me that you can't avoid the need for some kind of regulation to protect the interests of these much more isolated and vulnerable workers who are working either in their own homes or in other people's homes. Now, this sort of brings me in an indirect way to the first question. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. And it seems to me that these technologies have actually a very positive potential as well as a negative one. I don't see them in any simple way as empowering workers. Of course, flexible work is better than no work. That's clear. And we've always, I was doing research back in the 1970s on home workers in traditional industries, you know, making lace in their homes or this kind of thing. And you know, there are always people who will say positive things about precarious work because it's better than no work. And sometimes it can be creatively quite satisfying. But the main, you know, if you interview platform workers, what they mostly would much rather not be precarious. They'd much rather have a proper job. And this so-called flexibility of being able to work when you like is actually not a real flexibility. It's flexibility for the employer. For the worker, it's unpredictability, which is not flexible. You can't arrange your childcare because you don't know which day you'll be working next week. You can't plan a holiday because you never know if a job's going to come in on Friday that you have to finish for the Monday or whatever. But it seems to me that these technologies which actually enable the matching of supply and demand could be very, very positively used if they're used for the benefit of local communities and of workers. And one of the ideas that I think we should be trying to develop is the idea of using these technologies to kind of put back some of the public services that austerity has stripped away since the financial crisis, and more generally since the middle of the 20th century. Because an awful lot of the work that these platform workers in people's homes are doing is what you might call social reproduction work. It's care work, it's cleaning, it's looking after the house, it's household maintenance. Some of that is work that used to be delivered by public services, or at least feminists asked that it should be delivered by public services. You know, I come from the generation where we wanted public laundries, you know, and public childcare and these kind of things. And so it seems to me that it would be possible to set up local platforms that provide local work for local people, to deliver services to other local people. The technology that enables you to order a pizza from Deliveroo could also be used to deliver a meal to an elderly person who's just come out of hospital who needs food delivered to her home, for instance. It could deliver emergency babysitting to somebody whose partner is in hospital. It could be used, and if it's done in the right way, if it's not done in just a way that kind of undercuts the local public sector workers, it could actually add an awful lot of value at the local level. And the value that's created by these workers, instead of the 25% rent going to some multinational company, that money could be used to give, you know, pension contributions, to decent employment, paid holidays, maternity rights, and so on, for the platform workers. So it seems to me it could become a basis for a kind of, if you like, local digital welfare state that could be to the benefit of local communities and local workers. I mean, this is just an idea, but I think some experimental schemes would be really, really useful. So one could explore the positive possibilities for these technologies.
I have two a comment and a question. The first is I think it is each day more difficult to think and understand the evolution of work without understanding the evolution of the firm, because firms are really evolving also, and the disappearance of the Fordist firm is very much related to a lot of phenomena that I think that that can explain the evolution of labor. And with the Fordist firm is also disappearing the welfare state, because the Fordist firm mean the conventional employment relationship. So my question was, if in your project you do some association or some reflection, trying to think together the evolution of the firm and the evolution of work. And the second comment is about the link between platform work and platform work and innovation and competitiveness. I have the feeling that platform work is really at the margin of the labor market. I mean, it's part of the secondary segment of the labor market, as used to see it, the economists of labor. I mean, a primary labor market and then a secondary labor market, where tasks are, where work is taskifiable, where you can divide and separate tasks, and where innovation is coming, and where competitiveness is coming from. It is from real firms. I mean, with a work totally different from platform work, and maybe this is why we find platform work in the rural areas. So, isn't platform work just at the margin of innovation and competitiveness?
Shall I come back? 5 minutes. Right. That's a really, really interesting question. I think it's got two parts, the normative model of work. I think I'll put that to one side. There was another question about, because I think it's more interesting to look at the firm. And it seems to me that increasingly it's not useful to look at the firm, it's more useful to look at the value chain. And if you look at the whole value chain, you see that highly precarious work at both ends, so to speak, of the value chain. But the final mile, the last mile of delivery, for instance, from the goods, when the goods come from the Amazon warehouse and they reach your home, that is an area which is very much kind of platform work, and also at the very the primitive extractive level, you find, for instance, in Africa, a lot of child labour in mines and so on. You know, there's a highly precarious work at both ends of the value chain, and the reason it's important to look at the value chain is because if you want to kind of understand the dynamics of capitalism, if you like, you have to understand, a lot of people get this wrong, that value creation and value realization are two different things. Value is created by lots and lots of different workers doing in lots and lots of different labor processes in lots and lots of different parts of the world. But that value is only realized when the commodity that they're making is actually sold. So it could be that the iPhone on the container ship on its way from China, that iPhone never gets sold. You know, that somebody brings out a better model, or there's a scandal that the battery is going to explode, or the ship never makes it to the port, or whatever. So there's an enormous pressure on labour all along the value chain to get the goods to market as quickly as possible, to get that good to the final consumer. And there's digital labour involved in that, the processing of the order via the website, and there's physical labour involved in that, whether it's assembling the components, getting them onto the container ship, getting them to the warehouse on the truck or whatever, and finally getting it to your home. And the more complex the global division of labour, and the longer the value chains, the greater the pressure there is on labour at every step in the chain. And algorithmic management, which is another way of talking about platformization, is absolutely crucial to speeding up that value chain as fast as it's humanly possible to speed it up. And in that sense, I think we have to almost see the modern firm as the algorithmic model of a value chain, where a lot of the workers may not be direct employees of the company. It may be several different firms to whom they outsource things or who supply them with services. But that algorithmic management is absolutely key to this process of value realization, value creation, value realization, and in linking all that together, the work organization that brings it all together.
Muito obrigado a todos.